Okay, well, we've been talking about pro-social behavior and finding punishment methods of enforcing norms and so on. This talk seems to be kind of appropriate since it examines some alternative possible norms and tries to relate some of the things that social norms to models of biological evolution and related things. Get this crank in here. Okay, so as you know, there are lots of different commands about how people should behave, and many of them are classified as golden rules. Different religions state them somewhat differently, and these rules, they sound similar, and you will hear people piously pronounce that these are all, this just shows that all religions are pretty much the same. But indeed, when we look at them a little more carefully, these rules are not exactly the same, and I think they differ in rather interesting ways. Anyway, we'll have a look. So one class of rules of this type, what I call the love thy neighbor rules. So the Old Testament version of it is thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The Taoists have a similar rule, which I think has pretty much the same content. Regard your neighbor's gain as your gain and your neighbor's loss as your loss. So I will model those two as the same. You may decide they too are different. Another set of rules are the Hebrew or the New Testament rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And Aristotle had this statement: we should behave towards friends as we would wish friends to behave towards us. Now, one might want to say that Aristotle's rule is not a rule, but a definition of friendship. But in either case, notice that this is not literally the same thing as love your neighbor as yourself. It's do unto others as you would have them do unto you. There also, we'll find in variants of these rules, different specification of who are the relevant others. So Aristotle's pretty clear: friends. Of course, you can still say that's just a tautology. Well, I guess we should read more Aristotle to see who he thinks are friends, and then deal with that. The Jainists have kind of an interesting version. A man should wander about treating all creatures as he himself would be treated. So you're walking down the street and meet a dog, invite him out for a beer. Another class of rules are the negative do unto others rules. So Confucius' version is never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself. The Talmud has it, that which thou likest not being done to thyself, do not do unto thy neighbor. That's the whole of the Torah. The remainder is commentary. The Buddhists: hurt not others in ways that you would find hurtful. And the Hindus: this is the sum of duty. Do not do to others what would cause pain if done to you. Yet another form of rules of this type are the reciprocity rules. So the most famous to us is Kantian rule: act only according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. I'll propose an operational version of this whenever there's a room with a Kantian philosopher involved. He'll explain that this isn't what Kant really meant. Kant maybe meant nothing operational. There's another relative of this rule. Do for one who may do for you, that you may cause him thus to do. And the source of that is interesting. It's the Eloquent Peasant. It's an Egyptian tale from 2000 BC. The doggerel poetry, on the other hand, is from an Englishman, translator R.K. Parkinson. I don't know what it sounded like in ancient Egyptian sentence rule, but it seems to be a clear call for reciprocity. And this is more operational than conversion. It means, do those things that you would like being done if the other guy's going to do the same thing. So, to understand these rules better, I think it's very fruitful to pose them as rules for how to behave in a game. And I'm going to do this in a way that seems quite natural. We'll suppose that people have well-defined private payoffs, with private interests, and the golden rules are advice about how you should value the private payoffs of others. This is not entirely obvious that things should be that way among people that care about each other. Why is there really a self-interest at all? And you could imagine there not being. In fact, of course, biology suggests a nice interpretation of what's your self-interest. It's your long-run reproductive success, as well. Anyway, we're going to look at models where you have a clearly defined your own interests and from there. I'm also going to, at least at first, simplify by discussing symmetric games, and I'll talk about two-person symmetric games. I think this is the most sympathetic environment for these golden rules. This is where you would expect them to apply most cleanly, I think. I've done some work with multi-person versions, and I think it's not so difficult to see how you would extend these things to multi-person symmetric games and so on. We'll also remark on what should we be doing in asymmetric games, and I think there's some interesting, biology gives us some interesting clues about how to model ethics for asymmetric games. Okay, so the idea is, let's suppose that your private interest is given by a function u of x, y. X is what you do, y is what the other guy does. So we're doing a symmetric game, two-person symmetric game. So if I do x and the other guy does y, I get u of x, y. And what does he get? Well, he's doing y and I'm doing x. He's getting u of y x. If I love him as myself, I care about his interest as much as my own, presumably I'd be acting according to this utility function, u of x, y plus u of y x. I put equal weights on my own private payoff and his private payoff. So that seems a simple enough story. Oops. There must be a better way to control this.
It's a different button.
There must be a different button somewhere. Yeah, what am I not?
Let's try this. You do.
Yeah, where's the
Just
finger?
make it a full view.
Oh,
And then you
yeah.
can just use the arrow. It's kind
Yeah,
of
right. Yeah, that would be good.
The test and texture. Here.
Why don't you go down to the
Oh, down here, huh?
bottom left?
Oh,
Is there a?
and do it as a PowerPoint.
Yeah, that's what I was
Then
trying
you
to.
well,
just
this is a PDF file, so it's not a PowerPoint.
Well, usually if you
Oh, right down here, huh?
Is there a? I'm
You
trying
still
to
want to go full
Get
screen.
the finger down.
Doesn't seem to work. There we go. Anybody else want to do this?
let's see, why don't I try pulling it down to
I'm
just
not sure.
operate it from down there?
How am I going to do this?
You know,
Full screen, full
Where is
screen.
it?
No, higher, 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 higher.
I got it. All right, there.
you
Then just use the arrows.
Now we're good.
Right?
Yeah.
Just use the left and right arrow.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. Yeah, good. Okay. So here's what we've, that,
Can I
Okay.
ask
Yeah.
a question? That first
Sure.
equation,
yeah,
utility functions are typically unique up to, at best, a ratio scale.
mm-hmm.
So that's quite undefined.
In this version, it'd be additively separable, so that'd make it unique up, yeah.
Well, I'll accept that the other person's utility function can vary all over the place by a constant. And yours can too.
I want to use but I want to use the same weight on mine as on yours,
That's presuming interpersonal comparison.
precisely. Well, in fact, I'm proposing that it's a symmetric game, so there's a well-defined, in fact, for the biologists, it'd be my long run fertility and your long run fertility. These be cardinally measured. That's certainly right. I could have made L of xy a symmetric function of these two, symmetric nonlinear function of the two variables, and that would still be in the flip. That would still sound like love thy neighbor as thyself, because it's treating his benefits symmetrically to mine. And that's a reasonable point, I think. So we could have made L of xy any symmetric function of u of xy comma u of y x. But we'd use the same u function because we're supposing it's a symmetric game. Well, the do unto others. Oh, and I might add, any of these ethics are really demanding you to make an interpersonal comparison of some kind. How do I treat my brother relative to myself? So I've got to have preferences on what happens to me and what happens to him. So it's going to spell it out. I have to have some, and these are advice about what they should be. So the do unto others then, well, I do to him what I want him to do to me. So if he's y-ing, how should I feel about doing x? I should say, oh, well, how will he feel if I x when he y's? So this is my do unto others. This is how I should act so as to maximize d of xy, given that he's doing y. The Kantian says, oh, well, no matter what he's doing, I should do the action that I would like to do if I thought he was going to do the same thing as I. Of course, here's where the real Kantians would say, oh, that's not Kant. I guess I don't care if that's not Kant. I'm going to call it Kant.
It's a different concept.
So do the last two don't require any interpersonal comparisons, do they? Or am I missing something?
That's correct, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. You wouldn't have to, that's a good point. You wouldn't really have to think at all about what's in the other guy's brain. Although notice that for this one, you'd have to know what the other guy is doing. You don't have to know his taste, but you have to know what he's doing.
You have to know the set of actions.
Yeah. If this one, you don't even have to know what he's doing. Then the negative do unto others golden rule. Well, we could, of course, we could construct the action space in such that the negative do unto others is just another way of saying the do unto others. But I don't think that's the way the language is used. And I think I'm suggesting that what these rules seem to be saying is something like, well, don't harm anybody. You're not required to do good to people, but don't harm anybody. So somehow there's there's some action that you could say, let's call this action doing no harm. Now, I mustn't do anything that makes the other guy worse off than he'd be if I did no harm to him. And so, for example, the advice, say a negative do unto others guy would not throw his beer cans on the beach, while the positive do unto other guy would not only not throw his beer cans on the beach, but would pick up the litter that other people leave.
And the X0 is independent of Y.
Yeah, I'm thinking it is. You know, thinking about what these rules. I mean, don't rob your neighbor. Don't kill your neighbor. Don't do bad things to your neighbor. And so, what are the things that mean doing no harm? You know, we could presumably make it a set of things.
Yeah, it could depend on what kind of precautionary.
You're right. No, I mean there might be interesting.
Everlasting.
Yeah, you're quite right. Yeah, it could be interesting. So I want to now illustrate that these games, that these ethics don't always tell you to do the same thing. And I'm going to do that with a few examples. One of these is about two friends. They both drink cheap scotch. Expensive scotch costs 80 bucks. But the truth is that expensive scotch is only worth $60 to either of these guys. They're considering buying a bottle of expensive scotch. Each one thinks about buying a bottle of expensive scotch for the other. We'll suppose there are two strategies. You give your friend a bottle of expensive scotch, or you don't. The private payoffs are, well, if neither of us gives, then of course we both get 0. If I don't give and you give me a bottle, that's worth 60 to me. I get this nice bottle of scotch. I don't pay anything for it. A nice bottle of scotch is worth 60 to me, not 80. If you give and I don't give, well, you're out $80. And so that's the payoff to me. This one, here's a typo, right? This should be you if neither of us gives.
GG.
Oh, this should be GG. Yeah, if both of us give, we're both out $20. Why is that? Because each of us has spent $80. Each of us winds up with a bottle of scotch that's worth $60 to us. So we're both worse off than if neither of us had given. Oh, it seems pretty clear. Now let's see what the ethics say about this. If you're a do unto others type, as you do unto others as you would wish others to do unto you, well, you say, let's see, if the other guys, well, what would I, yeah, so would I, so you ask yourself, would I like the other guy to give me a bottle of scotch? Yeah, damn right I would. So now, I'm following the do unto others rule, so I say, no, yeah, right? I know that I would like him to give me a bottle of expensive scotch, so I better give him a bottle of expensive scotch. So they do. On the other hand, the love thy neighbor type, okay, he looks at the sum of my utility plus his utility, if he gives the scotch and if he doesn't. And he says, oh, well, it's clear. It costs me 80 and it gives my neighbor a benefit of 60. Giving the scotch is $20 worse than not giving the scotch, so it doesn't give it. The Kantians go the same way. They ask, is it better for me if neither of us gives the scotch, or if both of us give the scotch? The answer is it's better for me if neither of us gives scotch. So the Kantians don't give. And the negative do unto others, of course, the negative do unto others rule says, don't steal the other guy's scotch. It doesn't say give it. So in this case, we have the do unto others type fall into the Christmas gift trap, and they're worse off for it. All the other ethics don't fall into that trap. So let me propose another game. This one, a kind of redistribution game. Thinking about how do you act if you're lucky and your friend is not lucky. So imagine two neighbors. A coin is tossed. If it comes up heads, one of them gets 100, the other gets 20. If it comes up tails, payoffs are reversed. In the game, after the coin is cost, each of you is given an opportunity to give any of his winnings to the other. Okay. So let's suppose that both of them have concave von Neumann-Morgenstern utility functions, so they're risk averters, and each chooses a strategy of what to do in each outcome. Well, the Love Thy Neighbor players and the Kantian players, I claim, would choose to make transfers that leave their wealth equal. Right? They've got diminishing marginal utility of income. The Love Thy Neighbor guys are going to want to maximize the sum of the two guys' utilities, so they're going to equalize incomes, and so they'll just give $40 so that they wind up with 60 and the other guy has 60. The Kantians would do the same thing. The Kantian says, well, what would I like the rule to be? And in fact, the best rule for me would be this insurance, the winner shares profit. The do no harm player, of course, would not give anything. All it says is, don't steal from your neighbor. The do unto others player would give his entire winnings to the other guy. And so the first two rules lead to equality of income ex post. The last two lead to inequality, but one way is that the winner is rich and the loser is poor. The other way, the loser is rich and the winner is poor. So I've made, I then want to think a little more about comparing the workings of the Love Thy Neighbor with the Do Unto Others in other games. In particular, this one's a little prisoner's dilemma game. And this one's going to be one where it turns out that the Love Thy Neighbor rule is better. I'll then show you one where the reciprocal, the Kantian rule, is better. So in this one, it's a prisoner's dilemma game with the feature that the total payoff is bigger if one cooperates and the other defects than if both cooperate. So to maximize the sum of the payoffs, you will want one defector, one cooperator. It's still set up so it's dominant strategy to defect, but efficiency suggests if you're going to maximize the sum of payoffs, it would be better to have one defector, one cooperator. So let's look at these ethics. So the do unto others utility, well, you'd certainly, in this one, you'd always like the other to do C, no matter what, and so you do C. And so the outcome is both cooperate. I mean, the outcome, if both guys are do unto others types, is they both cooperate. The same goes for Kantian utility. If both are Kantians, they say, well, is it better if we both cooperate or if we both defect? It's better if we both cooperate, so they both cooperate. The Love Thy Neighbor. So, well, you want to maximize the sum of my payoffs and your payoffs. Well, that's T plus S. To do that, the Nash equilibrium in a game where we have players like that are, there's two Nash equilibria, one where I cooperate and you defect. And if I love you as much as I love myself, if I'm cooperating, you're defecting, do I want to change my action? No, because it's true I would gain something, but I wouldn't gain as much as you lose. And so it would be an equilibrium to have one cooperator, one defect, and it could go either of the two outcomes would be Nash equilibria. And of course, in this instance, this is an efficient outcome in the sense of maximizing the sum of the payoffs. So there's a sense in which, for this rule, the love thy neighbor rule outperforms the reciprocity rule. Here's one that goes the other way around. Suppose, again, we have a prisoner's dilemma game, but this time, if I cooperate and you defect, the sum of our payoffs is pretty crappy. It's actually worse than if we both defected. Okay. So in this case, with the do unto others rule, and the Kantian rule, it's pretty clear that it's the only Nash equilibrium is both cooperate. With the love thy neighbor rule, a kind of a curious thing that now there are actually two equilibria, one in which we both defect and one in which we both cooperate. And let's see, why is that? Oh yeah. If we're both defecting, the sum of our payoffs is actually, suppose we're both defecting, and I ask, each of them says, should I cooperate? No, I mean, it's true it would be good for you if I cooperate, but what you gain is not as big as what I lose. So despite the fact that I love you as myself, we're trapped in this both defect outcome. So it's also true, of course, that with this one, there is an equilibrium where we both cooperate, and that's an equilibrium as well. If we're both cooperating, should I defect? No, because then the sum of our payoffs would be lower than if we both cooperate. Here we have an example where the love thy neighbor rule doesn't perform as well as the reciprocity rule. That goes either way. So in general, I want to think about some interpretations of these rules in cultural selection and biological selection. So the first thing you notice, the language of many of these golden rules are, how do you treat your neighbor? How do you treat strangers, but how do you treat your neighbor? And this, of course, seems to be kind of keyed on people with whom you have long-term relationships. And so, of course, one way of thinking of this is the environment. If there's full information about what each other are doing, this is the environment of the folk theorem. Well, there's all kinds of things that could be equilibria. There could be equilibrium with all cooperation. There could be equilibrium where men wear neckties. Any crazy thing you could think of could be an equilibrium. So one way of thinking about these rules, of kind of maybe cheap and simple way of thinking is, well, the religions we know about the ones we know about are mainly those that are from successful societies. And these are societies that have coordinated on rules that happen to be socially efficient. And so the story. And I think there's much to that. But we'll talk about it. Another remark then is that, say, the Kantian rule essentially picks the best symmetric outcome. But even in symmetric games, the efficient outcomes aren't always symmetric play. And that was one of our examples. So Kantian rules aren't necessarily the best coordinating devices for societies. They're pretty good ones. For some games, they work very well, but not for every game. A remark that if I have a little time at the end, I'll follow up on this. But it's kind of a general. So the question is, one question is, when do these alternative golden rules pick the same symmetric Nash equilibria? I showed some examples where they don't. But often they do. And just when is it that they do pick the same outcome? Well, it'll turn out that if we write down, if we assume that payoffs are differentiable functions, that the u's are differentiable functions, if we write down the first order calculus conditions for Nash equilibrium, you will find that we get the very same conditions for equilibrium in the love thy neighbor, among love thy neighbor players as we do among Kantian players. The difference, though, is, since calculus teachers love, you know, I think Don probably doesn't get as far as second order conditions, but once in a while, the first order conditions ain't the whole answer. And this is one of those cases. So you look at the second derivative with respect to your own actions at the symmetric outcome, and you will find that the second derivative is different for the love thy neighbor than from the Kantian, and in fact, in fact, there can be times when what's a local max for one is a local min for the other. We had some clues about that, didn't we, from these discrete cases that had two different equilibria. It'll turn out that if the cross partials are 0, then the second order conditions are the same. It'll turn out that it'll turn out that, let's see, with one sign, with the sign going one way, which I'll have to, doesn't matter for the moment. The sign going one way, they're the same. With the sign going the other way, they can be opposite. Essentially what's going on here is that the love thy neighbor rule doesn't ask, what if we both do it? Okay. So say, okay, I'll do what's best for me plus my neighbor, given what my neighbor's doing. While the Kantian rule asks, what happens if we both change our actions? And so these don't always give, Nash equilibrium isn't always the same for the two rules. Another remark is, if we look at the world around us, of course we don't see people abiding by love thy neighbor or by Kantian rules, at least not entirely. In some societies, these things are worse than in others. So you might well ask, what's the point? Why should a priesthood demand behavior that nobody satisfies? Kind of a hopeless thing to demand people love thy neighbor as thyself or treat each other as. Maybe it makes sense to just settle for, don't kill your neighbor, don't steal his cows, don't make fun of his wife, things like that. Don't do that. Don't ask him to love your neighbor, that's a little excessive. So it's arguable that this don't do rule, class of rules, which is very, very common, is more modest and may well be more effective, at least in many societies or in many environments. I don't know nearly enough about societies or religions to be able to be able to offer anything more than a suggestion that that might be something that you'd look at, that it might be that environments where it's tougher to get cooperation, you might settle for a weaker rule that, say, reduces violent conflict rather than expect a great deal of mutual assistance. The next set of remarks I wanted to make was to relate these notions to biology, and some of this, of course, we can relate back to models of cultural selection. So we have Hamilton's rule, which could be said, stated as, love thy neighbor R times as well as thyself, where R is thy coefficient of relatedness to that neighbor. Hamilton. Hamilton probably didn't speak Elizabethan English very often. Oh, Jacobean English, but
It's close.
It wasn't my language.
This probably sounds more like Hamilton than like Kant, anyway. So, for Hamilton, Hamilton suggested that the rule should be essentially you should try to maximize what he called inclusive fitness, as a function of what you do and what your neighbor does, which is your payoff plus R times your neighbor's payoff, where R is the coefficient of relatedness. And of course, we notice a couple of things about this. First of all, this rule is not a proscriptive rule. Hamilton wasn't preaching. He didn't say that's what you should do. He says that's what he expects to see. He also answers a question which many of these ethics don't have much to say about, although there is an interesting story in the New Testament about this. He answers the question, who is my neighbor? And to what extent is he my neighbor? He says, well, my neighborness is measured by my coefficient of relatedness, by the probability that if I have a rare gene, my neighbor, will also have it. We notice, of course, this is a much less demanding rule than the golden rules. For siblings, R is 1/2. For cousins, it's 1/8. For strangers, it's about 0.
What do you mean less demanding in what sense?
It's less demanding that R is 1/2 rather than 1.
Oh, okay. But to capture your models, you could allow R to increase. So.
That's correct. Yeah. And indeed, in environments where, say, suppose we're talking about your wife, a couple of things going on there. I mean, her reproductive interests are pretty close to yours, and the other is you're in a long-term relationship where how you're going to be treated, and who's going to be your wife, for that matter, depends on how you act.
So I think all of your rules could fit, if you let R be anything, all of your rules could be fit here except the Kantian rule, is that right?
All of the rules could be.
Could be embedded in this.
No.
This,
They could not, because, yeah.
except for the Kantians.
No, the do unto others rule, well, yeah. In fact, let me write some stuff.
Yeah, by allowing R to become infinite.
No, the thing is, this one, well, let's go a step further and then we'll talk about that. Yeah. So here would be the semi-Kantian rule. Act as would be in your self-interest if with probability R, your neighbor will copy any action you take. Okay. Now, I claim that this is the rule that evolutionary biology really implies. It's not inclusive fitness for this. I'm not the first to say that. And also, I think cultural evolution suggests that. And the reason is this, that, say, suppose I'm a mutant with an unusual way of treating my brother. Maybe I'm nicer than usual. Okay. What's in it for me to be nicer than usual to my brother? Well, what's in it for me is that if I'm a mutant, the probability is 1/2 that my brother is also a mutant. And then, if I do the X where everybody else is doing Y, the probability 1/2, I'll be reciprocated by another X. With probability 1/2, my brother will be the old Adam, and in fact, I'll be doing X while he's doing the usual thing. So this would be their semi-Kantian rule. Now, why is this not the same? Let's relate this to the love thy neighbor rule. So we have one rule. Let's do this. L of xy with u of xy plus, say, if r is 1/2, that would be plus, well, let's just put r here, plus r u of y. X, and let's take the first derivative and second derivative of this guy. These are the first and second partials. And L prime prime right? So it's what's the derivative of my payoff with respect to my own action? What's the second derivative? And of course, this one's going to be negative if, say, the u prime primes are both negative. Now let's do the semi-continuum one. R u of x. First derivative. With respect to my own action is r u sub 1 plus r u sub 2 plus 1 minus r u sub 1. Which is just equal to u sub 1 and that's plus 1 minus r u sub 1 of x. That's r u sub 2 plus r u sub 2. And notice that at a symmetric outcome, it's the same first order condition as we have over there. But the second derivative is not the same. Because I'm going to get an extra term here. I'm going to get r u sub 1, 1 plus r u sub 1, 2 plus r u sub 2, 1 plus r u sub 2, 2 plus 1 minus r u sub 1, 1, which will be u sub 1 look like that. Difference, these are not the same if u sub 1, 2 is not 0. This means that, in particular, if u sub 1, 2 is positive, this one could be positive while this one is negative. There could be Nash equilibria for love thy neighbor types, which are not Nash equilibria for do unto other types. And you won't find any, you won't cure it by fiddling with R. These are just plain different structures. So I wanted to say a little bit about what happens with what to do in asymmetric games. And I thought that a nice way of getting started, and I think there's a general principle here, is that I think genetics is going to symmetrize asymmetric games. And so if we look at genetic models of inheritance, we actually can use what we learned. We can use the formalism we learned from symmetric games to apply to asymmetric games, just recast the model. So, for example, imagine, just one example, suppose that in general, games are going to be, think of games that are asymmetric. Each player falls into a role for one reason or another. So a very simple example is one player gets to be the older brother, the other the younger brother. You also obviously can have things change if you're brother or sister, male or female. If you happen to be born big, happen to be born little, all these things. But now imagine that your genes carry instructions for what you do if you turn out to notice that you're the older brother. And they also carry a set of instructions for what you do if you turn out to be the younger brother. Okay. Now, what makes this interesting, what makes the biological interpretation powerful here, is that the genes that tell you what to do if you're big brother are carried both by the big brother and the little brother. And so a gene that makes, say, big brother be good to his little brother the reproduction of such a gene is going to be influenced by the fact that often the little brothers are carried, often that gene is carried through one generation by a little brother. And so that gene is more likely to be passed on if it's a gene that makes big brothers good to their little brothers than big brothers nasty to their little brothers. So we can model that. We can write payoffs to, now a strategy includes both what do I do if I'm little brother, what do I do if I'm big brother, and we can write these things out formally and reinterpret them. And when we do this, it turns out, and this is where I'd start to be writing ugly formulas if I told you in detail. But I'll tell you how some of this comes out. So one issue here is, do the instructions for how you should act if you're big brother and how you should act if you're little brother, do they stick together? Are they on the same chromosome? Or do they get separated frequently by genetic crossover? Turns out that if the way you act when you're big brother and the way you act when you're little brother are usually inherited together, then the predicted equilibrium is it's found by this semi-Kantian function over there. On the other hand, if the alleles that determine how you act in each role are unlinked so that crossover is likely, then it'll turn out that the equilibria are actually the equilibria of the love thy brother half as much as you would love thyself. There's a little bit of notes of that in this paper. There's actually, those results were developed by a paper that involved some incentives of kin selection anyway. My son, who's a biologist, and I wrote this paper called Does Mother Nature Punish Rotten Kids? And in that the question we addressed there particularly was weaning conflict for mammals. And in the process we found these results. Foolishly, we published that paper in a journal called Bioeconomics, thinking about the crossbreeding of disciplines and so on. Turns out nobody in the world reads bioeconomics. So I think that's probably the place.
So I don't know, you may have about something called adaptive dynamics. Does that familiar to you?
Not to that.
So adaptive dynamics would say it's fine to, it looks like this system is particularly rich for thinking about these problems. There may be ESSs in these systems that you can never get to through any sensible evolutionary dynamic. Or there may be places you can get that aren't ESSs. Now, what do I mean by,
exactly. I know what you mean. Yeah.
so now what do I mean by a sensible evolutionary dynamic? Well, that would mean, let's suppose that Y is established in the population, and I invade with X. So I'm taking X close to Y. If X does better than Y, then it displaces it. And then if, and then we keep doing this until we get to something.
Sure.
And it turns out there are strategies that are what's called Convergence Table
Okay.
to this, which may be ESSs and may not be ESSs. And if they're not ESSs, then you end up branching. On the other hand, there may be ESSs that just are not reachable by this. And it all comes down to the second order conditions, and they're very nice conditions. And yours fit, remind me very nicely of this. So I'd be, especially in some of these examples you gave, I thought it would be fun to look at the differences between these functions to see if you could ever get to these ESSs.
If you could write down some references for that.
And Carl knows the
Okay,
literature, I'm sure, too, but
yeah,
I'll send you some stuff.
Yeah.
So you cast these rules as advice to actors.
Okay, yeah.
Another way to think about them is they're advice to third parties who have to judge the rightness and the wrongness of actions taken.
Okay.
I think actually that's mainly how things work here. Well, they work both ways, but I wonder if you have thought about how that would change your analysis if third parties were judging and administering.
Okay, so I mean, as far as my thinking has probably been pretty casual. I mean, I was thinking that, like you, this is advice to behave. It's also advice whereby to judge other people. How would we get people to behave like this when their instincts are not that way? Punishment strategies occur to me. So you could imagine that, in fact, these are alternative ethics that you pin punishment onto it, and so on. And that's about as
So
far.
then it has to, so the punishment's going to evolve through the feedback between the behavior induced and the welfare of the punishment.
Right. I look at your behavior and I say, has that guy been acting like he loves his neighbor?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Or do I say, has that guy been acting kindly? And they aren't always quite the same. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a Kantian philosopher, but I can see why if there was a Kantian philosopher in this room like that,
Yeah.
they would be kind of
Right.
kind of
It's fun to see them do that.
because when you're dealing with Kant, I mean, there's this very strict distinction between a hypothetical and a categorical imperative,
Yeah.
and the hypothetical is prudential and can be assimilated into a utility function. Ideas of categorical imperative can't be. I think that's quite important here. Because what you're doing is you're taking a rule and you're making it completely reducing it to an individual level and saying it's just a utility function. A lot of what we mean by rules really cannot be reduced to that. We think about Joe Henrich's experiments. You can take the utility function, you can manipulate that across different cultures, but different cultures play games very differently, and the reason they play differently is they have a different norm, there's different expectations. Rules are expectations about how other people are going to play the game, not something which you have actually internalized as a utility. So
Yeah, but I mean, I agree that these are not the only norms possible.
Are they norms at all, though?
Pardon?
Are they norms at all?
Well, no, what we want. I mean, if you think what's decent, if society have notion of what's decent behavior and what's punished and what's respected. And I can quite imagine that they aren't all measured by utility. But one thing I'm worried about a bit is, in fact, the difference between love and reciprocity. So there are differences that I haven't captured in this modeling. One of them is, of course, that is so in a lot of environments, a loving guy and a reciprocal guy are going to behave the same way, as long as you can see him. But the loving guy will be nice when you don't watch him. The reciprocal guy will be nice when you watch him. The other part is that, in fact, people tend to detect how much others love them. And they then build their expectations about the other guy's strategy based on what kind of guy they think he is. I haven't modeled here. Yeah.
There's an old paper I was discussing back in the days when I was a graduate student by Jim Buchanan. And I'm just curious what you know. It's a paper called The Samaritan's Dilemma.
Yeah, I remember it, yeah.
Right, because that, of course, was the first time I saw introduced into a game the idea that there would be a weighted utility function such that one's payoffs would be determined not simply on one's own immediate payoffs, but on some function, some weight attached to the other payers' payoffs.
Yeah, sure.
And again, Jim, as I remember correctly, has a result, just one small piece of what you have, arguing that particular kinds of rules that where you act not knowing how the other player is going to act can nonetheless, even if there is Samaritan-like motivation, lead to bad consequences in terms of combined utility. And I actually have a truly obscure paper, probably not as even more obscure than a paper in bioeconomics, in a journal journal that Gordon Tully briefly edited, in which I generalized Jim Buchanan's model to the case of sadomasochists.
I won't ask any questions about
So
that.
here,
Send it to the journal, say
where we're not looking for universal rules, but rules which we would ethically prescribe, but rather what the consequences would be in societies where there are individuals with a variety of utility functions, including ones in which pain to others is in fact regarded as good to oneself.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so you mentioned briefly the possibility of asymmetric chaos, which just means essentially that you have not homogeneous preferences across the population, right? So I was wondering, and this is something I've actually thought about as well in terms of the golden rule, and these various iterations of it, I guess you might say. And so there's different consequences, I think, for different levels of heterogeneity and preferences for these different rules, which was already pointed out partly by the demonstration. Wondering if you thought more about that. And, for example, I mean, we may have completely different preferences. Like I may want you to do to me what you don't want.
Right. Yeah, Sir thought about it. The part I thought about most, the part that where we get, I think, cool results are the genetic models where you detect your role. You see what's happened to you in life, then your genes tell you conditionally what's happened to you. And so, in fact, female, you will have different preferences than if you were a male, but you're carrying the same genes that your son may. So those are easy to think about. I don't think there's a clear counterpart for those in cultural evolution, in that kind of synchronization. Yeah.
This is a technical point that doesn't affect anything that you said, but you will eventually get into trouble.
I always get into
What
trouble.
you called inclusive fitness is not inclusive fitness. It's what most people call inclusive fitness, and it's not. You just wrote down the fitness of one individual, the fitness of another individual, and you slapped an R onto one of those things.
Right.
Inclusive fitness is strictly on the marginal scale. So when you took the derivative and you gave the derivative of the benefit times the relatedness must be equal at equilibrium to the derivative cost, now you're working on the inclusive fitness scale. But the idea that you can add up your own fitness and all of your relatives' fitness weighted by the coefficient of relatedness is the most repeated mistake in the biological literature. And
It's not
always-
a, it's not a
always
question of
repeated by
can,
non-biologists.
it's not a question of can you do it, it's what happens if you use that rule, okay? So if
It
that
will
rule
some- it will
implies
sometimes-
the.
It will sometimes get you the right answer, but you're getting the right answer for the wrong reason.
Well, let's start, so one of the things that many biologists are very sloppy with is not noticing that first order conditions ain't the whole bloody story.
No,
Okay, so getting the
lots of
marginal
mistakes.
conditions
There's
is
lots
not
of-
enough.
There's lots of mistakes that people make, but inclusive fitness is strictly strictly has to do with marginal changes. If you read Hamilton, it's unambiguous, and it's
There's nothing unambiguous in that.
No, that's one thing that is unambiguous. If you read all the secondary literature, it's
Well,
completely ambiguous.
I mean, so
And
so
eventually-
making sense of,
Yeah.
Hamilton mainly, he's always thinking of a linear game, which U1, 2 is
Yes,
zero.
with the benefits and the
And
costs.
he doesn't know calculus from a load of manure.
Well, you
so
can continue to write it this way, but you will eventually get into trouble.
I always get in trouble.
And it's not good to propagate it because people repeat it because it's what people intuitively think is inclusive fitness, and then it just gets repeated all over the place, and then eventually the literature is just kind of a disaster. So
I don't know,
it
I mean, is
it's
there
more
a-
than just a passing time.
Is there a Vatican that decides that it's inclusive fitness?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
there is actually.
Okay, so I'd like chapter and verse about this, because I've seen this.
Yes, you have.
Yeah, many ways, many
I know,
times,
that's
many places.
it's the
So I
standard.
guess I've been attending,
Right,
the
you've been
wrong church.
repeating a standard incorrect expression. You can read, you quoted Alan Graffin. Alan Graffin has a paper called How Not to Define Inclusive Fitness, and lists all the various mistakes that people make,
Yeah,
and it's right in there.
okay, great.
So you're saying you shouldn't call it that, or it's not the right thing to, I mean, here, thinking about how do you maximize this payoff function is.
It'll also get you, it'll eventually, I can't give you off the top of my head an example which will show that it will lead you to the wrong answer, but it's true that it will lead you to the wrong answer under a wide variety of circumstances. You can only talk about it as, if I change my behavior, a cost is always defined in relation to a change. There is no sense of an absolute cost. And so the notion that the inclusive fitness has to do with a behavior which changes my fitness and it changes your fitness, and how do I weight the change in my fitness relative to the change in your fitness? There can be no meaning of inclusive fitness without a notion of change, which is why on the marginal scale, it makes sense.
So isn't that close to what I was saying at the end, that if you say, think of a population that's made up of individuals playing one strategy and now consider a slight change in that behavior.
Yes, but that's not what he wrote. He wrote a total utility and called it inclusive fitness, and he slapped an R onto the total utility expression. That will give you the right answer most of the time, and so it looks like it's the right thing, but it won't always give you the right answer. It gives you the right answer because when you took the derivative, you got the right marginal expression. So to the extent that you take the derivative of that thing and you get the right marginal expression, it will work. But we know that
Well, let's
It's just like saying-
this talk of the right seems puzzling to me. So I was discussing some alternative rules, ways you might formulate rules and then say what behavior is implied by these rules. Economists talk about utility, and in fact, we say what utility function explains this, but in fact, we don't care what the utility, we only care about the marginal conditions, and of course our statements are unique up to monotone transforms for many things, or up to linear half-line transforms for other things. But we don't say it's wrong to talk about utility. So I don't understand. I mean, I understand.
Maybe we can come back to that
Yeah,
in the discussion this afternoon.
Yeah, let's have one. It was a technical point, so.
Well, I'm wondering if it's just a technical point or if it's a deep point. Maybe we can come back to that in the discussion
Yeah.
later today.
I mean, basically, the way you define inclusive fitness, your inclusive fitness is infinite because you're summing up your own fitness plus positively the fitness of everything that you're correlated with. And it's quite possible that's just an infinite number, an infinite population, so.
Well, infinite populations are common mistake. They don't really exist.
Well, it isn't right, but it's the notion is that.
Yeah, I mean, you could, and he could get away from that by just renormalizing.
Remember the geometric series converge.
If I could remember what Ken Bidmore did, he made the same mistake and he got the wrong answer for a problem. I'm trying to recreate his mistake. and show you that you'll get the wrong answer if you just write down inclusive fitness limit, but I can't remember the
But I mean, you could replace your utility function by a weighted average of it, so you wouldn't get into
No,
the
we
same.
didn't work in this talk. He absolutely made some
Okay.
really strong claim about
Lunchtime.
inclusive fitness limit is the right answer by defining inclusive fitness that way.
Right.
And you can do that.
The right answer, you mean what's likely to judge.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just everybody's
But
going-
if you invoke inclusive fitness, you're implying that it's consistent with biological evolution. And if you write it that way, then it isn't.
Well, in fact,
Maybe we should,
if that's,
maybe we
if that's
should,
the-
And that's
private
where the
conversations
conversation's
at lunch, all right?
Well, look,